In 1700, India produced nearly a quarter of the world's entire economic output. It was the jewel of global manufacturing, renowned for textiles so fine they were called woven air, for steel so superior that Damascus blades were made from Indian imports, for spices that had launched 1,000 ships, and for diamonds that adorned every crown in Europe. The Mughal Empire's treasury overflowed with wealth accumulated over millennia. 2 centuries later, when the British finally left in 1947, India was one of the poorest countries on earth, contributing barely 3% of global GDP, its people starving, its industries destroyed, its resources depleted. What happened in those 2 centuries wasn't trade, it wasn't development, it wasn't even conventional conquest. It was the most systematic, bureaucratic, and sophisticated wealth extraction operation in human history. This is the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And the story of British India isn't about the past. It's about how empires are really built, not on battlefields, but on balance sheets. The paradox at the heart of the British Empire's relationship with India is this. Britain claimed to be civilizing India, bringing railways, rule of law, and modern governance. And yet, every economic indicator shows that India became dramatically poorer under British rule, while Britain became spectacularly richer. The wealth didn't evaporate. It didn't disappear into thin air. It moved systematically and deliberately from Indian hands into British coffers. And the mechanism for this transfer wasn't just military force, though force was essential. It was something far more insidious, the transformation of an entire subcontinent into a captive market and resource extraction zone, enforced through tariffs, taxes, and trade manipulation that made resistance not just illegal, but economically impossible. Let's start with how Britain got control in the first place, because it reveals the template they would use for 2 centuries. The British didn't arrive in India as conquerors. They arrived as merchants. The East India Company received its charter from Queen Elizabeth I in 1600, granted a monopoly on English trade with the East Indies. At first, the company was just that, a company. It built trading posts, negotiated with local rulers, and bought Indian goods to sell in Europe. Indian textiles, particularly cotton cloth, were in massive demand. European wool couldn't compete with the quality, comfort, or beauty of Indian fabric. The company made fortunes as middlemen. But here's where it gets interesting. The company didn't just want to trade with India. It wanted to control the terms of trade. And in the 18th century, as Mughal central authority weakened, the company saw an opportunity. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 is often taught as a military victory. Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal, and Britain gained control of one of India's richest provinces. But the real story is financial. Clive didn't win through superior forces. He won through bribery, betrayal, and banking. He cut deals with the Nawab's generals, promising them wealth and position if they refused to fight. The battle was over before it began, bought and paid for. And what did the East India Company gain? Direct control of Bengal's revenue collection. They didn't just conquer territory. They conquered the tax system. In a single stroke, the company transformed from a trading business into a sovereign power with its own army, its own laws, and access to the tax revenues of 20 million people. The company could now fund its operations not from profits in London, but from taxes collected in India. The conquest would pay for itself. This was the original model of corporate colonialism. Within a decade, Bengal was in ruins. The company's revenue demands were brutal and inflexible. In 1770, a massive famine killed an estimated 10 million people, roughly 1/3 of Bengal's population. Did the company reduce its tax demands in response? No, it increased them. Fields lay empty, villages were abandoned, and corpses lined the roads. But the revenue targets had to be met. Company officials became fabulously wealthy. Clive himself returned to England with a personal fortune worth over $5 billion in today's money, extracted in just a few years. When questioned by Parliament about his conduct, he famously declared, "I stand astonished at my own moderation." He wasn't joking. By the standards of East India Company officials, he had shown restraint. His colleagues were taking even more, but personal enrichment by company officials was just the beginning. The real wealth extraction was structural, built into the economic relationship Britain imposed on India. It operated through 3 mechanisms, each devastating on its own, catastrophic in combination. First, de-industrialization. When the British arrived, India's textile industry was the most advanced in the world. Indian cotton cloth was cheaper and better than anything Europe could produce. British factories, newly mechanized during the Industrial Revolution, couldn't compete. So Britain didn't compete. It rigged the game. The company imposed crushing tariffs on Indian textiles entering Britain, often exceeding 70%. Meanwhile, British textiles entered India tariff-free or with minimal duties. Indian weavers who had exported their cloth across the world for centuries suddenly found themselves undercut in their own market by inferior British products. The results were annihilation. By the mid-19th century, India's share of global textile exports had collapsed from over 25% to nearly zero. Millions of weavers lost their livelihoods. The Bengali countryside, once dotted with thriving weaving villages, fell into poverty. The British Governor-General himself noted that the bones of cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. This wasn't market competition. This was deliberate industrial destruction, designed to eliminate Indian manufacturing and create captive demand for British goods. India went from being an exporter of finished products to an exporter of raw materials and an importer of expensive manufactured goods. The entire structure of the Indian economy was inverted to serve British interests. Second, taxation and the drain of wealth. Britain needed India to pay for its own occupation. The British Indian Army, which garrisoned India and fought Britain's wars across Asia and Africa, was funded entirely by Indian taxes. Indians paid for the soldiers who kept them subjugated. But it went further. India was charged for the costs of British colonial administration, for the salaries of British officials, for the pensions of British civil servants, even for the costs of the wars Britain fought to conquer India in the first place. Every pound spent on the colonial apparatus was extracted from Indian peasants, craftsmen, and merchants. The tax burden was staggering. By some estimates, up to 50% of India's agricultural output went to taxes. And unlike taxation in Britain, where the revenue funded domestic infrastructure and services, Indian taxes funded the machinery of extraction itself. But the most pernicious mechanism was what economists call the drain of wealth, a system so elegantly designed it operated almost invisibly. Here's how it worked. When British officials, soldiers, and merchants in India wanted to send their earnings back to Britain, they didn't physically ship gold. Instead, they exchanged rupees for sterling bills in India, and the British government redeemed those bills in London. To balance these accounts, India had to export goods to Britain. But here's the trick. India never received payment for those exports. The payment was the bills of exchange themselves. India exported vast quantities of goods, everything from cotton and indigo to opium and grain, and received nothing in return except pieces of paper that benefited British nationals. Economist Utsa Patnaik has calculated that between 1765 and 1938, Britain drained approximately $45 trillion from India in today's value. That's not just wealth transfer. That's systematic economic evisceration. Third, the transformation of Indian agriculture into a resource extraction system. The British introduced new land revenue systems, most notably the permanent settlement in Bengal and the Ryotwari system in other regions. These systems had one purpose: maximize revenue collection. Under Mughal rule, land taxes had been flexible, adjusted for harvests, famines, and local conditions. British revenue collection was inflexible, fixed in advance, and payable in cash. For Indian farmers, who had traditionally operated in a barter economy, this was revolutionary and devastating. They had to sell their crops immediately after harvest to get cash for taxes, flooding the market and depressing prices. Moneylenders and middlemen, often backed by British commercial interests, stepped in. Farmers fell into debt traps that persist to this day. Land that had been held communally for generations was seized for non-payment and sold to landlords who had no connection to the soil but every connection to the colonial administration. The British also dictated what Indians could grow. Vast tracts of fertile land were converted to cash crops for export: indigo, opium, tea, coffee, and cotton. Food production fell. When famines struck, as they did repeatedly and catastrophically during British rule, there was no buffer. The most horrific example is the Bengal famine of 1943, which killed an estimated 3 million people. This wasn't a natural disaster. Bengal produced enough food to feed itself that year, but the British government prioritized food for the military, allowed merchants to hoard and speculate, and refused to divert supplies from other regions. Winston Churchill, when informed of the famine, reportedly asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet, and remarked that Indians breed like rabbits. The British response to mass starvation wasn't relief, it was indifference backed by racist contempt. Famines under British rule killed tens of millions. Under Mughal rule, famines had been rare and regional. Under the British, they became systemic and lethal, not because of crop failure, but because the economic system was designed to extract surplus, leaving no margin for survival when harvests fell. The railways, often cited as Britain's great gift to India, reveal the same extraction logic. Yes, Britain built 40,000 miles of railway in India. But who benefited? The railways weren't built to connect Indian cities or serve Indian commerce. They were built to move raw materials from the interior to ports, and British manufactured goods from ports to markets. The railway system was designed as an extraction infrastructure. Moreover, Indians paid for it. The colonial government guaranteed British investors returns of 5% on railway investments paid from Indian tax revenues. If the railways didn't generate profit, which many didn't, Indian taxpayers made up the difference. British investors made risk-free fortunes. Indians got the debt. And the railways, rather than sparking industrialization as they did in other countries, reinforced India's role as a resource colony. Raw cotton went out on the trains. Finished cloth came back in. The profits flowed to Manchester, not Mumbai. By the time of Indian independence in 1947, the economic devastation was complete. India's share of global GDP, which had been 23% in 1700, had fallen to less than 4%. Life expectancy was 32 years. Literacy was 12%. Per capita income had barely increased in 190 years. The industrial base was negligible. The country was divided, impoverished, and traumatized. The British left behind political institutions. Yes, they left behind the English language and a railway network, but they took everything else. The wealth accumulated over millennia, the productive capacity that had made India the world's manufacturing hub, the agricultural surplus that had sustained vast populations, all of it had been systematically transferred to Britain over 2 centuries. And Britain used that wealth to fund its own industrial revolution, to build its own infrastructure, to establish itself as a global superpower. The factories of Manchester were built on cotton from India. The banks of London were capitalized with Indian gold. The British Empire's global dominance was purchased with Indian wealth. Here's what makes this story so relevant today. The mechanisms the British used in India, the manipulation of trade rules, the extraction of resources through debt and taxation, the transformation of economies into raw material suppliers, didn't disappear with formal colonialism. They evolved. Today, we call them structural adjustment programs, free trade agreements, and debt service obligations. When the International Monetary Fund or World Bank imposes conditions on developing nations, requiring privatization of public assets, elimination of tariffs, and prioritization of debt repayment over social spending, they're using the same playbook the East India Company pioneered. The colonizer has changed from a flag to a spreadsheet, but the extraction continues. Wealth still flows from poor countries to rich ones, not through direct plunder, but through the architecture of the global financial system. The British like to argue that colonialism is ancient history, that modern India should move on, that everyone was conquering everyone back then. But the economic effects aren't historical, they're present. India lost 2 centuries of potential development. When Britain was industrializing, urbanizing, and building the infrastructure of a modern economy, India was being deliberately de-industrialized, impoverished, and locked into underdevelopment. That head start compounded. Britain's wealth today, its universities, its social systems, its global influence, all of it rests on foundations built with Indian resources. India's poverty, its infrastructure gaps, its development challenges, all of that traces directly to the wealth that was taken. The past isn't past. It's a balance sheet that's never been settled. The fall of the British Empire didn't come from military defeat. It came from economic exhaustion. By 1947, Britain was bankrupt from World War II, dependent on American loans, unable to maintain its global commitments. The empire became too expensive to hold.